Okay, this is a Triton Rendezvous project. We're the Ganymede team. I'm Andre Turpin,
I'm Justin Millsap.
I'm Matthew Portugal.
and this is our project for ARO 3090 orbital mechanics.
This slide represents the future slides I will be discussing. The goals and concepts for this project was that we wanted to be within a mass budget. We wanted to arrive within 15 years. We wanted to depart within a launch window between 2029 and 2033. We wanted to achieve a minimum of one flyby, and we wanted to meet a specific C3 requirement. The critical results from our designs were that we met the mass budget of the trajectory. We arrived within 11.8 years of departure. We departed within the time frame. We exceeded more than one flyby, and we did meet the C3 requirement. Below is a chart that shows all the different trajectories that were designed by the team. The first trajectory that we designed was a direct home and transfer to Neptune, and this ultimately did not work due to it exceeding the time of flight requirement. The second trajectory design was a gravity assist with Jupiter. This trajectory did work, but we wanted to see if we can optimize a better trajectory. The third trajectory was a gravity assist with Mars. This trajectory did not work due to a collision with Mars. The fourth trajectory that we designed was a 2 gravity assist with Mars and Jupiter, and this specific trajectory design will be discussed in future slides.
Okay, so once we came up with some general parameters of all 4 trajectories, what we did is compare all of them, and ultimately we decided on the 4th one, which is a Mars and Jupiter flyby. So the way we actually came up with choosing this trajectory, again, we compared all 4 of them, and then right off the bat, we eliminated 2 of them. The first being the direct home and transfer to Neptune because it exceeded the time of flight requirement, and the transfer that uses Mars as a flyby because of the collision. So that just left the Jupiter flyby and Mars and Jupiter flyby as our 2 options. And ultimately, it just came down to a difference in performance and efficiency. So we just went with the trajectory that would give us better C3 and time of flight efficiency, which turned out to be the Mars and Jupiter flyby. Now, this is a general timeline of the mission and how it would look. We would launch from the Kennedy Space Center on February 9th, 2031. The first leg of the trajectory would take about 95 days, which is when we would arrive at Mars for the first flyby. The second leg would take about 558 days, which at that point we would arrive at Jupiter. And then the final leg is going to take about 3,649 days, obviously being the final stretch of the mission. And ultimately, we would arrive at Neptune on November 21st, 2042, which is about 11.78 years after the initial launch date.
So delving deeper into the trajectory, we're going to look at the pork chop plots, and the highlighted region on the left is the C3 that we wanted to leave Earth with. We wanted this to be a relatively low C3, and just keep in mind these are estimates, and we'll delve into the deeper details later, but we decided on a C3 of 80 to leave Earth, and we arrived with a C3 of 300, as you can see on the right. This time of flight was around 95 days. We arrived at Jupiter with the same C3 we left Mars with, which is 300 kilometers squared per second squared. And this correlates to arrival C3 of 80. The time of flight for this transfer is 575 days. The next pork chop plot we're going to look at is the Jupiter to Neptune leg. We arrive at Jupiter with 80 C3, and we leave Jupiter with 140, or we're going to arrive with 140 C3 at Neptune. The transfer is around 3,650 days in the highlighted regions where we can show this.
Okay, so once we had a general idea of how the pork chop plots looked and kind of some base values for C3 and time of flight, what we did is find some more specific values for the times of flight in C3s. We did so by using Dr. Maggia's interplanetary transfer code. And we were able to tune these values to just squeeze out a little extra efficiency. So the departure C3, we were able to lower it from 80 to 73.7. And you can see here the changes in the C3s just by optimizing the trajectory a little bit. The time of flight mostly remained the same, although there was a little difference that, again, allowed us to make the trajectory more efficient.
This slide shows how we determine a launch departure window. We chose to launch from the Kennedy Space Center, and it has a maximum azimuth angle of 35 degrees and a minimum azimuth angle of 35 degrees and a maximum of 120 degrees. We chose the azimuth angle to launch from to be 45 degrees, which lines up for a good trajectory to Mars.
So looking closely at the flybys, this comes straight from the pork chop plots and then later from the interplanetary transfer MATLAB code. We arrive at Mars with a C3 of 309, and the corresponding V infinity vector is shown below. The magnitude of this is 17.585 kilometers per second, and the C3 of departure is exactly the same except the velocity vector changes. Using these velocity vectors, we can calculate some orbital parameters pertaining to the delta, turn angle, eccentricity, and most importantly, the altitude. The altitude has to be positive. That way we know it doesn't run into the planet that we're flying by. The next flyby we did was at Jupiter. The C3 upon arrival was around 80, 78.48, and the same thing. The V infinity vectors are different, but their magnitudes are the same. And then using these vectors, we can calculate orbital parameters such as delta, beta, the eccentricity, the turning radius, and most importantly, like I said, the altitude. And in this case, it's positive, so it's a successful flyby.
Okay, so once we had an idea of how the flybys would look, what the V infinity and the spacecraft velocity would look like when we were approaching Neptune, what we did was design the desired capture orbit around Neptune. So we did this by looking at the relation between the radius of periapsis of a circular orbit around Neptune and the associated orbital energy or orbital velocity that came with that radius. And based on that, we looked at trying to minimize the amount of C3 required to burn that velocity that we came into the sphere of influence with, so that we could reach that desired orbital velocity and subsequently orbital radius of periapsis. And so ultimately we decided to burn in a magnitude of 33.41 kilometers squared per second squared of C3 to reach a radius of periapsis of 197,000 kilometers around Neptune.
And the orbital parameters for the circular orbit are shown right here. The eccentricity is 0 because it's a circular orbit. The energy, the radius of periapsis is stated below in the period of the orbit, which is around 2.4 Earth days. Okay,
so in terms of the mass budget, once we had our entire trajectory planned out and the impulse burn C3s calculated, we were able to look at the SLS capability graph. Based on the total C3 requirement of the mission, which was about 107 C3, we looked at the plot that was provided by the NASA SLS handbook, and based on the capabilities, we determined that the available payload mass was 2.77 metric tons, and that also accounts for the 1,500 kilogram payload that the mission begins with. So we will make it to Neptune with a margin of 1,277 kilograms. So this is a visualization of how the mission would look. There's some simplifications in this model. Firstly, we didn't account for any separations. So obviously the boosters here throughout the mission. We just passed through a Mars flyby. And so right now we're in the leg towards Jupiter, and here we see Jupiter. Also, we're under the assumption that all these transfers are coplanar just for the sake of simplicity of this visualization. And then here we just passed Jupiter and we're on the final stretch of the mission. Yeah, some things to note is that this visualization is, again, pretty simplified, and it's just to get an idea of kind of how the mission would look and where the spacecraft would be at a given epoch. And so we can see here as we're approaching about 3,500 days after the initial launch date, we can see that we're approaching Neptune here, getting ready for that last impulsive burn. Another thing to note is we didn't actually demonstrate the physical impulsive burns at each of the times of the burn. And then here we can see that we're in a circular orbit around Neptune. It might not look very circular, but again, it was just an oversimplification.
So in summary, we calculated a lot of these parameters using MATLAB, and we also use programs such as Blender, Microsoft Excel, and Microsoft PowerPoint in order to make this project doable. In conclusion, we're going to launch from the Kennedy Space Center on February 9th, 2023. Sorry, that should actually be 2031. We also are going to have a gravity assist at Mars and Jupiter, and also arrive at Neptune on November 21st, 2042. Here is a compliance matrix, which shows that all of the categories listed on the far left were compliant except the lunar transfer. And that concludes our project. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.